All right. Well, give us an update as to where we are. I mean, Turkey has not been really on the radar, at least from a political standpoint. Obviously, a major earthquake there, but and a lot of refugees in Turkey, sort of fallout from the Syrian civil war. Give us an update on what's happening there and what's been happening there.
Sure. So we are a few weeks out from an election, a general election and a presidential election. This is the 100th anniversary of Turkey's foundation. And I use Turkey because Turkey is kind of like a pro-government signifier that is being used at the moment to polarize the Turkish population and consolidate power. So we're close to this election, and it's a very tense election because the Justice and Development Party, the ruling party of Turkey, has dominated Turkish politics for the last 2 decades. Their support in recent years has waned, but this upcoming election looks like it's going to be, at least on paper, the most competitive presidential election that has happened in the last 20 years. And it's important to understand, originally, when the Justice and Development Party came to power in 2002, Turkey was primarily a parliamentary system of government. But as the AKP consolidated its power, and more specifically, Erdogan consolidated his power, there was this shift to move the country to a presidential system. Erdogan became the president, and then basically in 2017 rewrote the constitution, forced through a referendum under very tense, under like a system of emergency law. There was a referendum held, and Turkey became a presidential system. And so Erdogan is running for president. There is actually some debate on whether he's allowed to run for president, whether he's done his 2 terms, or the fact that they changed the constitution means that he gets to do another term. So he's running for president again. But the luster of the Justice and Development Party has sort of worn away as the country has become more authoritarian. Economic problems have multiplied. And of course, the kind of X factor that happened most recently was this absolutely tragic earthquake that took place, in which hundreds of thousands of people were displaced, thousands were killed, orphans, I've seen pictures. It's absolutely disastrous. And of course, people may not remember this. One of the reasons that the previous Turkish government became so unpopular, propelling the Justice and Development Party to get to power, was that there was an earthquake in 2009 in which the government response was very weak. This earthquake, there's been a lot of criticism about the government response, and this has definitely sort of made this election seem far more competitive.
Can I ask you about that government response, though, and what the criticism is? Because from the outside, it seems like, Erdogan gutted a bit of the disaster programs that would have helped here, and there were some other critiques that it's hard to tell, from here in the U.S. reading like a Time magazine article on it. Yeah.
So after this 2009 earthquake, there were a slew of laws and taxes designed to prepare for exactly this eventuality. But, one of the characteristics of the Justice and Development Party's period in office has been a massive construction boom. Many of these contractors have close ties with the government. So there's this huge construction sector. And there has been obviously corner cutting. There has been, people have been, whipping up buildings as quickly as possible. A lot of money being made, and a lot of the regulations have been ignored. In fact, the government was proposing armistices for people who, had, cut corners in construction, so you could get your building sort of retroactively certified in order because it didn't meet construction code standards. So this huge construction boom has happened, and a lot of development has taken place in Anatolia, which has historically been more undeveloped. So But this earthquake has kind of knocked all this down in a very short period of time. The weakness of this construction has been fully exposed. Many hospitals, government buildings, these new contracted buildings collapsed. Many people died because of this. New apartment blocks, they just weren't earthquake proof. And so, this kind of corner cutting to have this rapid development has come back to, bite the government in the butt. At the same time, Erdogan's initial response to this was to be very angry that people were reporting critically on, how fast the government was responding, the failures of certain government institutions. They began attacking civil society organizations that were trying to deliver aid. They tried to block Twitter, which was actually a way that people were finding each other in the earthquake. So there was a lot of, there was already a lot of bubbling discontent about the inflation and the economic conditions in the country, the growing polarization and authoritarianism. But, this earthquake was magnified that crisis to a massive degree. So the election was delayed. There was a delay to the election, but it's now going ahead. So the earthquake, they were forced to postpone it for a couple of months. But we're now heading into the election, and this earthquake seems to have, to a certain degree, galvanized the opposition and given them confidence that they might have a shot at winning this time.
I seem to remember when Erdogan took power, and even prior to that, he was described as someone who was going to, if not invigorate Turkish democracy, certainly sort of like modernize it maybe. And there was, and maybe I'm wrong, but this is what I recollect in terms of like the way that he was sold at that time, and also a secularist. And at various points, people have found him to be more authoritarian than people had presumed, more dictatorial, and also more sympathetic to, imposing Islamic law within the sort of civil society. Is that a fairly accurate notion? And where is he now? Largely, it seems like it was always a function of like who he had to make certain alliances with and where he was drawing constituencies. But give me a sense of that.
Yeah, that's an excellent observation. So Erdogan is a kind of chameleon-like, almost opportunistic political leader, and the Justice and Development Party, when it first came to power, was a real political party with, lots of different factions in it. So the initial coalition that came into power in 2002 was made up of the provincial bourgeoisie, as it was, a rising provincial bourgeoisie that was irritated by the old Kemalist, secular nationalist, big bourgeois sections of society that had a different cult, that was culturally quite different. Now, a lot of this got filtered in the West through this discussion of secularism versus, Islamism. But, a lot of these issues were also class issues. So, for example, a big issue during the early AKP era was, women with headscarves going into universities. This was like a huge issue. Now, people in the West often looked at this as this is Islam versus secularism, but this was a class issue because you had these upper class, westernized people in the West of the country who didn't like these kind of like country bumpkin, lower class people coming with their headscarves and their like particular mannerisms, etc., etc. So you had this coalition led by Erdogan and his political party, which included this, provincial middle classes, many of whom got rich as a part of Turkey's neoliberalization during the 1980s and 1990s. You had a growing urban poor who were, culturally moving to the cities and, culturally wrangling with the existing elites in the city. You had these high bureaucrats and military people. And Erdogan was able to build a coalition that included not only, poor conservatives and provincial middle class people, but liberals, liberal Islamists, particularly this Fethullah Gulen movement, this movement based in Pennsylvania. So you had this big coalition, also included many Kurds who rankled under the old secular nationalist Kemalist elites, and this coalition came to power. And for the first 10 years, we had this liberalization process. And, at the time, many people in Turkey saw this as like the bourgeois revolution, the liberal revolution is coming to Turkey finally. We've had this society where the primary antagonism has been between the state and society, but now finally Turkey has matured enough, and now we have this conservative but liberal, neoliberal, Western-orientated government in power. The United States was very interested in this kind of model because, these conservative provincial bourgeois elements, they were pro-Western because they exported their stuff to Europe, fridges, foods. They were highly connected with the Western economy. So we have this liberalization period. And even myself, at the time when I was in Turkey, I thought, oh, maybe, that we're finally getting to this issue. But what was happening was there was a struggle taking place over control of the deep state, the apparatus of the state. So the old entrenched elites, these Kemalist, secular nationalist types, they gradually were being displaced. And, this culminated in several important court cases, most notably the Ergenekon court case, the sledgehammer operation, where prosecutors connected with the Fethullah Gulen movement, which was at the time aligned with the government, basically purged a whole load of old guard nationalists from the army and the bureaucracy. They put them in jail. So we have this liberalizing phase taking place where the AKP is gradually getting control of the state apparatus. And it's doing all kinds of things, including a political opening towards the Kurdish community, moving away from the old style repressive policies directed towards the Kurds. And, so a lot of people were very hopeful, but you have the two big things which begin to shift the orientation of the AKP. You have the 2008 economic crisis, where the limits of neoliberalism come into sharp focus. And then, of course, you have the Arab Spring. And over a period between about 2009 and 2015, 2016, when you have the coup, you see this shift towards a more authoritarian government. You see the protests in Gezi, which are suppressed by the government quite viciously. And then you begin to see in 2015, you have an election where the AKP lose their parliamentary majority. And rather than accept that, Erdogan kind of restarts the Kurdish war in order to consolidate his nationalist base. And so Erdogan moves away from drawing support from liberals and Kurds towards rehabilitating some of those very people who had been, put in jail by his former allies, the Gülenists, who he begins to purge massively from the administration. So we see the shift taking place from 2019 to the coup in 2016, where Erdogan realigns the state. He reformulates some of the neoliberal policies towards a more sort of state capitalist kind of political order, and begins to go in a more a political direction which increasingly draws on nationalist, anti-imperialist kind of themes. And the regime has always been a conservative regime, but this conservatism isn't purely Islamic as well. There's a kind of secular version of this conservatism. It's not too dissimilar from the kind of secular version of the cultural war, like right-wing atheists that you have in the United States. You have right-wing, non-traditional Muslims supporting, you see, I'm waiting for the word woke to get translated into Turkish. It seems only weeks away to happening because they're already talking about trans people, gay people, so you have this like big culture war taking place in Turkey. So you have these periods of polarization. The first period is a kind of liberal polarization where you have this coalition that is brought together against the old Kemalist elites. And then this new coalition which crystallizes after 2015, which shifts back to relying on very reactionary right-wing nationalist and militaristic elements of society. And then the old quote unquote liberals, the Gulenists, the Kurds, they're now in the crosshairs.
And we should say, just fun fact, if I'm not mistaken, Mike Flynn was either hired or certainly sort of like applying for the job of kidnapping the Gulen in
Pennsylvania.
In Pennsylvania, while he was also working on the Trump campaign. I mean, it's just a
Day of the election. It was
side
day
gig.
of the Trump election.
Side gig.
Day after Trump election, there was an article published, I believe, in The Hill, where he was basically spouting the Turkish government line about the Fethullah Gulen people being, terrorists. And of course, the Fethullah Gulen people had been instrumental as kind of Erdogan's shock troops during the early phase inside the bureaucracy, inside the police force, inside the judiciary. And they played very dirty, but, they fell out with Erdogan. And they tried to expose the corruption that was going on. And instead of people turning against Erdogan, they were the ones who got played and purged.